remember to buy a copy of your favorite books from the Cheeky Merchants. If we don't have it, we'll source it for you, but we'll definitely find the book for you.
Hello, Cheekiness. Hey, Cheeky Man, how are you?
I'm doing well, thank you. Always good to be in conversation with you. How are you doing, Boo?
I'm okay. I'm alive. I'm good. The less I say, the better. I'm good. So we have a special guest today, so I'm really excited for that. And I'd love for us to just jump into the conversation. I'm going to start by introducing tonight's guest. We are in great company as always at the Cheeky Neighbors. Today's guest is Iris Mwanza, who is a Zambian American writer and now the Deputy Director of Women in Leadership in the Gender Equality Division at the Gates Foundation. She's worked as a corporate lawyer in both Zambia and the US and holds law degrees from Cornell University and the University of Zambia, and PhD in International Relations from the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. In addition to her work at the foundation, Mwanza serves on the supervisory board of CARE International and on the board of directors of the World Wildlife Fund, US. She's also the author of today's book, which is called The Lion Dead. Welcome, Iris. We're so excited to have you on the Cheeky Nations. How are you?
I am well. Thank you for having me. I'm so delighted and excited for this conversation. Of all the things that I do, writing is the thing I love, my creative outlet. Having a conversation about my debut book, it really just warms my heart immensely, especially with you two. I've been listening to your podcast. I love it. And I love what you're trying to do. And I really appreciate being part of this community. So thank you again.
Thank you so much. Your bio is impressive. I always feel like we live our wildest literary dreams because we get to speak to people who we want to speak to. I was interested in the title of the book, right? And obviously we'll know as we go into the book why it's this. But I wanted to know from you, The Lion's Den, like why? Why that as the title of your debut novel?
It's a great question, and I'll try to give you a succinct answer. Initially, The Lion's Den was a chapter, not the title of the book. You've spoken with authors, you are a participant in this community. It is a negotiation about what the title is going to be. Then you start to engage in the marketing side. As a writer, you produce this book or what you think is a finished book and you're lucky enough to sell it. Then you get an editor and the editor is like, I don't like your title. The original title was The Good Boy. And I was like, no, I like the title. This is my book. I decide. And then you sold the rights. They're very elegant about it. But I think as you get into the next phase, which is post-writing into thinking about who's the market, then you start to get educated. So I was schooled about how this works. And one thing that I do have is some humility. And when I meet experts in the field, I think it's good. I don't always listen to them, but I will listen to what they have to say. The original title was called The Good Boy, which I really loved. I thought it was just, of course, it came from me. But after some conversations, and also if you Google The Good Boy, you get some rather interesting and spicy responses, which have very little to do with literature. A combination of things. It was my title, but it was the title of a chapter, not the whole book. So I felt I still had ownership. But it becomes really interesting. And as reading the book, it almost takes on a bigger meaning because the Lion's Den obviously is from the Bible. But there's a lot of connection to ancestral spirits, which is embodied in the leopard. And so I think it became even more interesting to me. It started off as a battle, as I must have my way to really understanding more about the publishing business. And then also coming back to myself as a creative and think, actually, this is interesting because you almost have, as part of the story, is the backdrop, but as part of the story, this tension between religions, traditional religions, which were brought by the colonialists versus this strong history that we have as Africans around our ancestors and the spirit world. There's an interesting conversation between one of the characters, Father Sebastian, and the protagonist, Grace. because in her mind, you can't reject some spirits and then embrace others. The Holy Spirit, if you say the Holy Spirit exists, then why can't our spirits exist in equal measure? She has quite a logical mind. So it's either you believe in spirits or you don't. She can accept if you say, look, I'm an atheist, I don't believe in any of this. But if you say, oh, I believe in this, but not that, she has issues with that.
So, all right, I guess that needs to be taken patient, like, and I think about the geographical thinking. Look at the in Zambia in the 90s. It's interesting. I think a lot about what it means to write about a place, all the prison we live, that's a cook that all living. I'm curious about what it meant for you to write the story in the place that she did, but also writing about her when you no longer what
it means a lot to me. First of all, I wrote about a time when I did live there. I was a student there. The setting is very important to me. It's something I know very well. But I think some of the things I've been drawn to as an author is the repetition of history. The things we assumed at that time would be ancient history, but are still very resonant. Even though I don't live in Lusaka anymore, my parents are in Lusaka, my best friends, because these are my college friends, people I grew up with. And I have deep roots and community, my extended family. My father came from a family of 10. So when you start doing the mathematics, I feel like everyone named Mwanza in Zambia is related to me somehow. And it's a place that I definitely, and it's interesting. My husband is African-American, and he's like, when you talk about home, you always mean Zambia. But why is that you don't think of the US as your home? I'm like, I do, but Zambia is really where my heart is. And even though there's some difficult topics in this book, there's some things that I wanted to capture, which are really beautiful, I think, and just how incredible with the trees, the jacarandas in October, where you have avenues that are lilac, or the flame trees, the bougainvillea. It's just a place of astounding beauty, but that doesn't mean that we can't have both of those things, which is the reality, right? We have these beautiful countries. I think it's the same in South Africa. All of Africa, this incredible, majestic landscapes, yet that doesn't mean that we don't have problems that we need to confront. I think writing is a way for me to have these discussions, or at least my hope is to initiate some of these conversations about what is troubling. It's set in a historical place, space, and time, but the law at the center of the novel that criminalizes same-sex relations is still the law today. That's actually a colonial law, which has been continued, but there is no energy or movement. In fact, it's going in the other direction. Homophobic societies, no progression, no movement in the community to try to change things. And that was part of the impetus behind writing the book and talking about some of these subject matters, which I think we'll probably go into a little bit in the conversation, and bring them more to the fore in a way that is easier. I believe there are a lot of people who are advocates. I could include myself. There are people who are activists, really important group of people. And then there are authors, and I think we all need to figure out how to link arms a little bit better so that we can start to change things. That's my hope anyway.
It's also interesting to think about the genre choice or the subject matter of the book, particularly as a debut novel. We've seen a lot of white writers write legal thrillers, but a Black woman writing a legal thriller as a debut novel is quite an interesting choice. And I wanted to speak a little bit about that, like why it was important for you to particularly choose this genre choice as your debut novel.
It's such a great question. Honestly, as a debut writer, you're not even thinking about things like that, right? You just have a story that is insisting in your mind, it's persisting in your heart, and you feel like you have to get it out there. So when people are like, oh, you start dealing with an agent and a publisher, and they're like, what genre? Yeah. That's a great question. I think it goes back to writing what you know and starting my career as a young lawyer and just trying to capture some of that enthusiasm, excitement, but also the naivete that you bring. I think maybe you can identify with this, as I know that you're a lawyer. Yes. What you think it's going to be versus what it is. And then through that experience and through the arc of the story, you also see Grace, who is a very green, but extremely determined fighter and advocate, learn a little bit about how the system works. You can't just go in there and say, well, it's the law and we are all fighting for justice and think that everything is going to go your way. Part of the story is her education. She comes in really believing. In law school, no one's going to tell you that the police are corrupt and sometimes the judges are corrupt or lazy or the system doesn't work. There's also a lot of politics involved. You can't just think about your case as a narrow, siloed thing. It is a living thing in an environment and an ecosystem, and you have to understand the ecosystem and how to navigate it. But I also love that Grace doesn't really care. She starts to understand, but my fight is a fight for justice. And that is what she's going to do, come hell or high water, both which do come to pass for her. She will go to the ends of the earth for her client, Bessy.
So I think it's interesting that you've spoken a little bit about the arc, which is a loss of innocence. I think a lot of Grace's character development is this loss of innocence. In the loss of innocence, she writes to criticize institutions that want to legalize their bigotry. I think a lot about the institutional abuse and the homophobia that is so well documented in the story. And so I was hoping you could speak a little bit to us about why you felt it was important to criticize the institution in writing the parallel with Grace's loss of innocence. It seems like the falling of the metaphorical scale from Grace's eyes is in many ways also a criticism, is the way in which Grace comes to an understanding of just how unfair these systems are. And almost to say, just because something is legal doesn't make it moral. There's a thing that you do in conflicting morality, legalism in the story. I wanted us to speak a little bit about writing to criticize institutions and what that looks like in telling the story of marginalized people.
I think it's so important that we are talking about how these systems oppress and how the impact is felt at the individual level. So it's not abstract. And I think the best way to do it is through fiction. So talking about real issues, real challenges in the world, but bringing them to a character that the reader can inhabit. Because we cannot be empathetic if we can't relate in some way. One of the things I was really trying to do, and which Grace has a great deal of empathy, almost to the extent of she can inhabit Bessy's situation. She's a vulnerable person herself. When you were talking about the scales falling from her eyes, I think part of that is in her education, her loss of innocence vis-a-vis the law. But she's had a tough time. She's had a hard road. She's experienced a lot as an individual. And so she brings that with her. But there's a moment early in the book where her and Bessy lock eyes and they're able to connect. She feels everything that he feels just for a second. But that's what she brings to her advocacy or her life as a lawyer. She's fighting for Bessy, but she's fighting for herself, and she's fighting against all injustice. She doesn't see it as separate things, which I think some people do. They're focusing, I live in the US, and so it's like around Black Lives Matter. And then there's another community focused on LGBTQ plus rights. That's what I do. And then women's rights. That's what I do. That is a way in which the systems can continue to oppress because it's quite easy to divide and conquer. My hope is that there will be more graces in the world that are able to look at all discrimination as a thing that needs to be fought. And I think especially when we're talking about the African continent, where there's a feeling like, okay, I'm not an immoral person, but I have issues. I'm still homophobic. Then you're not a moral person, because then you're talking about being discriminated against on the basis of your gender, or tribe, or class. We have our own systems as well that are oppressing people. So let's just get rid of oppression, identify it, and fight it as a united front.
We're taking a short break. We're taking a short break.
And I think just to link to that, vulnerable people in this book particularly exist in very close relations to violence. And violence is a major theme in this book. Often we think of violence in the extreme ways. Of course, Bessy's story is the more extreme end of this violence. But there is a sense that the vulnerable people throughout this book are always existing in very close relation to violence. And I want to speak a little bit about why violence is such a prominent theme in this book, and what the statements you were trying to make about what it means for marginalized people to exist in close relation to violence also they need for the kind of outcomes that these people have when faced with institutions of power and bigotry that you spoke to earlier.
Yeah, I think vulnerability is just that, right? It means you can't fight back. You can't protect yourself, which means you are subject to somebody else's power, somebody else's whim, and that can include violence. It can also include positive outcomes, but if you have no control of your life, it becomes really difficult to get justice where there is injustice. And this is how injustice continues. You have a community of vulnerable people who are not able to protect themselves, and the systems that are supposed to protect them don't exist, or they're part of the problem, which is what we see in the lion's den, right? The police should be protecting Bessy. Officer Lungu responds negatively, violently, not just to Bessy, but to Grace, because he sees Grace as a village girl. I don't need to pay attention to you. You have no power. I'm the one who has power. And so I think part of it is, it's not just about violence, but it is honestly saying, if you've got no power, then violence is going to be part of your life because you can't protect yourself. That's been what I've seen as a danger. It's a high risk. In the scene where Grace, Bessy, and Officer Lungu, I wanted that to come through. Hopefully it does come through strongly.
Yeah.
And this is an individual. It's not just about Bessy, but also Grace. She's young. She's a woman. The officer tries to hit on her. And then when things start going in a direction he doesn't like, he physically hits her. This to me is a reality. We know this. There's data to support this. It's not just fiction. This really does happen.
I wanted to speak about colonial interruptions, the legacy of colonialism and their handle. And I wanted to tie it to something that you do very cleverly in the book. We often don't speak about compulsory heterosexuality. And we see compulsory heterosexuality a lot in the book, right? And a part of it is this idea of colonial interruption, because the colonial law has come and told us that the penal code says it's against the order of nature for the carnal.
Even the language, right?
Even the order of nature, like whose nature, whose order. And I wanted to speak a little bit about, I thought what was really interesting was to think about Bessy's dad and Mr. Patel, right? We know there was a romantic relationship between those two people. And to speak about Bessy's mentor, who is now passing away because of HIV. During the time in which you've written this book, HIV was prevalent among men who were sleeping with other men, right? I wanted to speak about the reason why Bessy dies, the idea of trying to hide something that happened as a result of this colonial disruption of compulsory heterosexuality. And I wanted to speak a little bit about why it was important for you to explore that in subtle but visible ways.
Yeah, I think you raised a lot of different issues. I do want to point out Grace's father and Mr. Patel are not in a romantic relationship. they are best friends from childhood. The reason why I raise the distinction is because I think it's important for people to understand that friendship is friendship, love is love, and there are different avenues and channels for love. And you don't stop loving somebody, and you should never stop loving somebody for any reason, especially something which is actually none of your business, right? What somebody does in their time is none of their business. But also growing up in Zambia and going through that horrific phase before antiretrovirals, where AIDS was just devastating. This is a generalized disease on the African continent. When it comes to trying to stigmatize or assign some sort of blame in terms of how individuals are looking for scapegoats. We see this no matter what the situation is. We want to find somebody to blame. It's the immigrants who did it. It's the gay population that did it. It's the women that did it. Somebody is responsible for the pain that I'm feeling, or this awful disease, or whatever the situation is. I wanted it to reflect that. Grace's mother blames Mr. Patel, even though Grace's father actually is a miner and he lived on the copper belt and he was basically away from home most of the time. Most likely he contracted HIV and potentially brought it home. It becomes very complicated, but I wanted it to be very clear that the experience in Zambia and many other Southern African countries is quite different from, say, the experience in the US, where it wasn't as generalized as a disease, but the effects are felt by everybody, every family. At the height in Zambia, I don't know about the statistics in South Africa, but in Zambia it was 20%, about 1 in 5. Every family, my own family, my friends' families, everybody was impacted. What does that do to society? How does that impact everything, including your own young relationships? What does that mean when you have this fear in the back of your mind, engaging sexually, which is very normal for teenagers, but now you have this sort of Damocles over your head? It becomes really a different kind of thing. You're not talking about teenagers fooling around anymore. You're talking about Russian roulette. I wanted to capture that time and some of the issues and the stigma, the scapegoating that was happening. And it's not only unhelpful, it has the opposite impact, because people confront things front and center and say, hey, this disease is affecting all of us, and it will affect all of us. We need to just talk about sex. One of the other things we might come to is the role of the Catholic Church. I'm Catholic, but at that time, the Catholic Church was talking about, you just abstain. You're like, as a young person, that's not going to happen.
That's not that's true. Sometimes you gotta tell the truth. You telling me to abstain is not going to make me abstain.
Right. It doesn't work.
And I think there's an interesting choice that happens in the books. DB is highly respected and highly regarded. DB is a person living with HIV. We've spoken to the moral judgments that people make with diseases such as HIV that are sexually transmitted. There is a moral judgment on who gets the disease, right? Because there are assumptions made about your sexuality, and the Kokonoda has pointed out, or promiscuity and the like. And people go to great lengths to explain, oh, I got this from my long-term partner, etc. There's a powerful statement in DB being the person who is living with HIV, who eventually passes away from it, despite having access to medication and treatments that his poor counterparts don't. There's a thing about HIV almost being the great equalizer in a very unequal situation, in a very unequal living circumstance. That was just something that came to mind. But in speaking about great equalizers, I think of education often as a great equalizer. And I think for somebody like Grace, education becomes the saving grace. Grace would have landed up in an arranged marriage had it not been for this opportunity to go into education, which brings me to writing difficult relationships, right? Particularly the relationship between Grace and her mother. Grace's mother almost robs her of the opportunity to have an education, to have basements, right? And often the people in our lives are only able to dream through the lens of their own lived experience. So for Grace's mother, it may have just been unimaginable for a woman to go to school and then go to university and have university education. Potentially, this is why she denies Grace the opportunity to do that. But Grace still sends money home, right? Grace and her mother absolutely estranged. Her mother doesn't come to her graduation. They have no relationship, but Grace still sends money home. That encapsulates difficult mother-daughter relationships. As Africans, it's difficult to imagine mothers and their children not getting along well, because there's almost a stigma around, like, talking about a toxic mother, for example. You make a very deliberate choice to write about Grace and her imperfect mother and this navigation that they must do. I wanted to talk a little bit about why you wrote Grace and her mother and the relationship that they have, but also why Grace still feels some sort of material responsibility to her mother, this person who has been impeding her at almost every single step.
Oh, I love this question because the mom, I did try to bring a little bit of empathy to Grace's mom, her character. She's suffered a lot. All of her children have died. Her husband has died too and potentially infected her with HIV. She's lost her land, right? She talks about scratching in the dirt like a chicken. They're literally starving. Opportunity, in her mind, as their golden ticket out of poverty, hunger,
It's saving Grace.
and struggle. She's very myopic, but in a way that's understandable under her circumstances. Grace is talking to her about something very remote. And all she can think about are all the things that will go wrong. Like, how are you even going to pay school fees? Grace hasn't even figured this out, right? She's just like, I'm going to university. What are you talking about? We don't even have a pot of Nshima to eat. Now you're talking about bus fare, tuition, food, all this stuff. This is just a pipe dream. And to Grace's credit, she just has that stubbornness and determination, and she has that vision. And this has been supported by her father growing up. And this is going to happen for you. You're not like the other girls. I've struggled. I've suffered. I've been the only girl in a school of boys who harass me. They torment me. They give me hell every day. And now you're saying I'm going to marry a man old enough to be my grandfather? No, I'm not doing that. And it is a complex situation. I think if we look at it in black and white, it's like Grace's mother is totally wrong, which she is, and Grace is totally right, and it works out. But there's no guarantee that it would have worked out for Grace. There's no guarantee. But for Mr. Patel, who really saves the day and helps her. But if there was no Mr. Patel wasn't in a situation to help her. And Mr. Patel is not financially in a good place himself, but he sacrifices everything because he sees that vision and that dream as well. I tried to put it in a context which felt somewhat real for Grace's mom, and something that I think we all struggle with and we've seen. We know that child marriage happens, or really young girls being married off mainly for financial reasons or due to poverty. Trying to get into the mindset of how desperate do you have to be where that seems like either the only option or even a good option. That's what I was grappling with and trying to breathe some life into some of the realities of it. So yes, it worked out well for Grace, but in fiction, we can control the world a little bit. The reality is many people who would have these phenomenal careers do get cut off at various points. And that's part of it, where you don't have strong champions in your own family to make it possible. As you said, this could have gone many bad ways for Grace, but particularly if she had listened to her mother, we wouldn't have a story.
That adds to Mr. Patel, right?
Mr. Patel. I'm happy that things worked out for Grace, but I'm also mad that things didn't work out for Bessy. Think about what Sarah Hamid says when she says,
this is supposed to be a legal thriller. So
I'm not giving too much away in a sense that Sarah Hamid speaks about queer lives being ungrievable because we don't admit queer lives as lives, right? And I think in many instances, I want to speak about the conspiracy of the legal system. So this idea that for Grace, the law is supposed to be this beacon, justice, but she is encountering resistance at every corner. And she goes to the pastor because maybe some higher power, father will come and it doesn't work like that. Do you think about the everyday politics? You live in a system where justice is supposed to be on one hand, but everyday politics means there's a lot of corruption. And justice actually doesn't mean anything in some respects. And then you think about this element of religion, right? You've got Bessy's mom, who is so uber religious and is just like, oh my gosh, but on the one hand, I love my child. Love the sin and not the sin. And I wanted to speak about the bandwidth of everyday politics. You see, towards the end of the novel, there is this banding together of a lot of people. Ultimately, I'm still mad about what happens towards the end of the book, towards me in the book. I'm just mad, right? But I'm also hopeful in that when people have a common vision, that common vision can help bring justice outside of the courtroom. Because we often think of justice as just a legal outcome. But in this case, justice may have been a way to democracy for more marginalized people. So,
yeah, I think you said it well. Why does it have to feel like you can't be uber religious and supportive of LGBTQ plus communities? I don't understand why that becomes complicated. I wanted to interrogate that with Bessy's mom. I mean, Bessy's mom loves her child. That is her favorite. Everybody knows. But she also has challenges because she is this church woman. She's in a community that is very ultra homophobic. Until things happen, it's very hard for her to reconcile those things. And the society doesn't make it easy either. What I wanted to get to a little bit, obviously the arc of the story is around the legal thriller in some of these sidebars, is the familial relationships. And it's not as single. The family doesn't wholesale reject or wholesale embrace Bessy.
love the sister.
That's what you find in a family. There's family dynamics. So you might have your favorite sibling or your favorite parent, or your parent might have a favorite child, even though I love you all. But meanwhile, we know who gets the last biscuit and who gets to stay up late. Most families have that dynamic and also complicated issues to navigate. It's not central to the novel, but I did want to bring it in. I think particularly when you talk about African books, particularly as portrayed, or African stories as portrayed in the West, the nuance often gets lost, right?
Mm-hmm.
African family is not supportive, is homophobic. Yes, and it doesn't mean that everybody in that family or everyone in that community or everyone in that society is at all. So how do we start to tease out the complexity of family life, even when it's not central to this novel? I wanted to be sure to put it in so that people can, wherever they fall on the spectrum, they can relate to some characters in the book, and the book can meet them where they are. Even if you're very conservative, you might be like, I am with Bessy's mom, or I'm with Father Sebastian. If you're very liberal, I'm with Grace all the way. I think the beauty of fiction is that you go on this journey with a person in a way that you cannot live in any other way. We can be like, yeah, that's my bestie. I understand what they're going through, but you don't live with them even for a few hours in that way. You don't live in their heads. And this gets you into their heads, into their hearts, into their experiences. And you walk their journey with them for a little while. And hopefully you come out at the end with a changing happening. That's my hope, that you will change, or you will grow, or you will at least learn something. And if not, then you will sit with yourself, sit with your thoughts. Then that to me will be a giant win.
So you said you don't feel that Bessy's family is necessarily central to the story, but I think in many ways it actually is. I think that because of Bessy's family and even the way that their mother overcomes her own prejudices and her own difficulties in acceptance. We see her move through the spectrum of emotions. We see her almost have an initial denial about who Bessy is to moving to an acceptance of who her child is and what that means for her child. And we see her fight for Bessy in ways that so many people and children who look like Bessy do not have their families advocates and fight for them. And I don't know that Grace would have necessarily always felt empowered and felt the need to fight for Bessy if she didn't feel that Bessy's family was advocating for her in the ways that they best could, right? I think that there's almost this Western obsession with family looking a particular way and meeting you at this place of perfection, right? Always understand what your journey looks like as a queer person, always understand what it looks like to use your pronouns in the best possible way every single time. That doesn't make room for people who have had their histories interrupted by colonialism and this ultra-religiosity that strips us of our identity, right? That has us always feeling like we are always auditioning to be people and to be humans. And I guess that leads me to my question around what will be our final question, was to speak about religion and the ways in which it perpetuates a particular kind of harm. I think that we think about colonialism and how religion was used as a vehicle in many ways to have these colonial structures come in and interrupt our society. But then we've also had this recent rise of anti-queer law and anti-queer ways of being in our society, fueled by these ultra-religious pastors who say things, particularly in West Africa, for example, in societies that are considered to be very religious in Nigeria. We see how religious leaders fuel queer phobia and add to that sentiment. So I wanted us to speak a little bit of the ways in which religion is used as a vehicle to harm vulnerable people in our societies, particularly Father Sebastian seemed to place his flag on anything. Yes, Grace, I hear what you're saying, but I feel like Father Sebastian often has opportunities to be a good person, right? Or to be a person who stands on the right side of history and just often falls short. I wanted to speak about that in our final question about why Father Sebastian is such a central figure in making a statement about religion and the ways in which it perpetuates harm, particularly in African societies.
Yeah, Father Sebastian is an interesting character to me. I am Catholic and he embodies the Catholic Church in the novel. He's not an evil priest. He's trying to do the right thing in his mind, but the right thing in his mind is dictated by the Catholic Church. He is not going to think outside of the lines drawn by the system. And the Catholic Church is very clear. It's not a place that is equivocal. It's very clear. This is what the church says. This is the church doctrine. We will tell you what to think. We will tell you what is right and what is wrong. In some ways, isn't that the function of the church, except when the church gets it wrong? And we've seen this again and again. How particularly the Catholic Church, but not just the Catholic Church, I think it's any sort of institutionalized religion, they have this power and how they abuse it. They can use it for good, and sometimes I'm not saying that everything that the Catholic Church does is bad. It's not true. They do a lot in terms of supporting vulnerable populations, in terms of school. I went to a Catholic school myself. Food. I'm not condemning the Catholic Church wholesale, but they have a lot to answer for, and I don't think this plays out more in the US because it's a litigious society, and so there've been these huge lawsuits. But I think, what the Catholic Church's role in HIV/AIDS pandemic, they've not answered for the Catholic Church's role in perpetuating homophobia, and they have not answered for that. And then, as you said, I do tend to pick on the Catholic Church because I am Catholic, so I feel like I have the more license. But I think you're absolutely right. This rise of religiosity, which is almost unfettered and unchallenged, and some of the things that they are saying and doing and the harm, there's no accountability. And it's almost like you say you're doing it in the name of God, then nobody can question. And I think that's absolutely wrong. For the character, bringing it back to the book, and for myself, it's important to question. Wait a minute, that doesn't feel right. How can you be about religion and doing good and putting good out in the world, but at the same time condemning certain populations or people who live like you or people who don't necessarily agree with you. If you're a Christian, that's not what Jesus said. His message was the opposite. And yet somehow we've got it twisted. It's being spread out there like a virus. I think there's a lot of fear in pushing back. And it has been the downfall of civilization again and again, where we've let ideas or people or leaders spread this kind of hatred, discrimination, without and be completely unfettered and unchecked. And I think we're in a moment across the globe, but in the US as well, we are at this moment to see, are the institutions going to rise and challenge, or are they just going to sit back and let this chaos continue to spread? And then I think most of us have had experiences of, we've lived in dictatorial environments, and actually this is not benign at all. And it needs to be fought where and when and however it can. Oftentimes where you have fear or indifference, these things spread. And I see that certainly in Zambia, but in other countries as well. I see there's the spread of these ideas. And I do think it's not generalized. These are small populations who are usually well-resourced, very loud, and making loud noises, very threatening, using things like violence to silence the silent majority, and if not the silent majority, the indifferent majority. So I think that actually the call to action is against indifference, assuming that's not my fight, that's not my problem. We don't fight for everybody. That is going to be your problem down the road. Your number comes up eventually. That's what I definitely have seen in my experience, and I believe that to be true. And I just think that if we talk about morality and moral human beings and doing the right thing, it's very simple and straightforward. Let's just do the right thing. What's not to like about that, right?
Iris, it's been absolutely wonderful to be in conversation with you about this really fantastic debut novel. I'm sure you can tell from our questions and this conversation that Alma and myself have really enjoyed The Lion's Den. We hope that it will do amazing things in the world, and we definitely cannot wait to have you back, because you will be writing a sophomore novel and more books, and we will be talking lots and lots more about what goes on in your creative brain.
Thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure. It's important for me that this book is done really well in the US, which I'm delighted about, but much more important that this book is read on the continent, in South Africa, in Zambia, in Kenya, all over. I can have this conversation on the continent, then I will have done my job and realized the vision I have for this book. I'm grateful for this opportunity and time. Wonderful. Was it an hour or so? Went by so quickly. Wonderful amount of time that we had together. So thank you. And I hope I will see you in Joburg soon. We should do something in person. That would be so fun.
Sticky Natives, until next time, this is Baba.
Thank you for listening to this episode of The Cheeky Natives. Don't forget to subscribe, review, and rate the podcast on all your streaming platforms.